of you who may not know me, my name is Brooke Hotchkins. I am the Client Relations Specialist for the Schoolcraft College APEX Accelerator. We have several members of our team with us this morning: Olga Martinez, our Program Manager, Jan Dean, our Senior Procurement Counselor, and Shannon Wilson, another Procurement Counselor with the team. Before I introduce the Meerkat Cyber team and let them take it away with the fantastic presentation they have planned on CMMC compliance essentials, I do want to discuss a few housekeeping items. Please keep your microphones muted for today's presentation. We want to make sure everyone is able to hear all of the excellent and important information, and that may be difficult if there's any background noise. So please keep your microphone muted the entire time until we get to the breakout session and breakout rooms at the very end. If you have any questions during the presentation, please utilize the chat box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can click the chat button and enter them in there. They will then be asked at the Q&A period at the end of the presentation. Attendees will be sent a copy of today's PowerPoint later today. In order to make sure you receive these materials, please make sure your Zoom name matches the name that you registered under. If you registered under someone else and are attending on their behalf, where you may not be on my list, you can always let me know in the chat what name you would be registered under. We want you to get those materials. I believe that's everything that I needed there, so let me get started with introducing the amazing team of Meerkat Cyber. To start, we're going to Chris. Chris is a seasoned executive who has immersed himself in the Department of Defense's CMMC framework. As a trained aeronautical and astronautical engineer who complemented his undergraduate work with a law degree, Chris finds the marriage of technology and regulatory policy fascinating. He's worked as a Senate policy analyst and a chief tech officer for a cybersecurity firm, and has obtained the highest level of certification possible through the DoD's CMMC program: Certified CMMC Assessor, Certified CMMC Professional, and Certified CMMC Instructor. So he kind of knows what he's talking about, if I say so myself. With him also from the Meerkat team is Daniel Stark. Daniel is a seasoned entrepreneur with extensive experience as a government contractor and supplier. He served as the IT administrator for numerous manufacturers in the defense industrial base, along with serving in many roles for AS 9100 and NADCAP assessments. Also from the Meerkat team this morning is John Richards. John is an accomplished technology leader, entrepreneur, and a founding member of Meerkat Cyber. He has extensive knowledge in the managed service industry and practices the design and implementation of compliance-driven solutions with both Microsoft commercial and government clouds. And last but not least, if he's not with us this moment, he will be joining us later, Ozzy Syed. Ozzy is the founder and president of IntelliGRC, an innovative GRC platform that seeks to make authentic, intelligent, and scalable cybersecurity compliance accessible to everyone. So as you can see, it's an incredible team here to teach this morning from Meerkat Cyber. We are beyond pleased and excited to have them. Chris, I'm going to hand it off to you.
Thank you very much, Brooke. Thank you, Schoolcraft College, and we do appreciate Ozzy joining us from IntelliGRC. I received a note that he is running just a couple minutes late. I want to make sure to also point out Jaden and Abby. They are not going to be panelists today. They may join in, hopefully, but they are part of the Meerkat team as well. They both serve crucial roles. Jaden is our policy princess and gets into the weeds on all these details, and Abby has both CCP and CCA training, yet to take the exam because she just finished up, or exams, but absolutely a critical part of our team as well. Here's what we're going to talk about today, but we also welcome distractions and rabbit holes. And that's because there's so much that has happened over the last few weeks, including the release of the new rule. And if you guys have questions or want to go down certain paths, we would welcome doing that. At the end, we are going to do the SSP workshop, and we're going to try to save about 45 minutes to an hour for that. Break off into individual rooms, and you guys can absolutely ask questions at that point as well. But again, we like to kind of move with the audience. So if there are things that you guys want to talk about, let us know, or if you want to get into the more details because we didn't get enough details for you, we can certainly stop and go in other directions. So today we're going to talk about the new rule. We're going to talk about the implementation timelines. That is important for everybody that is a contractor, because you need to know, when should I be compliant? We'll talk about what the opportunity is right now. It's never going to be this big of an opportunity again. So we'll talk about why you guys want to possibly go get certified ASAP. Then into the documentation. This is the #1 way to fail an assessment. This is why we're here. We're going to talk about what they're looking at assessments. Ozzy has been in numerous assessments already. We have done numerous gap assessments and mock assessments. So this is where really the guts of make or break it play out. What you can do right now as a contractor and what you should be doing over the next several months. And then, of course, our workshop at the end. We're going to open this up to the panel here, but these are the 4 major topics that we think are important in the new rule. First, external service providers. Second, cloud service providers, FedRAMP. Third, assessors and assessments, what's changed. And 4, what contractors, which they call both OSAs and OSCs, organizations seeking assessment and organizations seeking certification. Both of those terms exist in the new rule, and what you as contractors will need to do. First thing we're going to do, though, is have a quick poll, because we like to understand who's in our audience and tailor our discussions to that.
The poll is running. I'm going to give it a few more seconds, Chris. We have lots of people joining in with commentary before I launch those results.
Awesome.
Brooke, while we're waiting on this, is the chat open for everybody?
Yes, it absolutely is.
Great. Yeah, to the participants, feel free to put in questions in there as well as we go along. You know, whoever is not speaking, we'll try to keep an eye on that and either bring it up to the group or address it in the chat.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I am sharing those poll results right now, Chris.
All right, we got 38%. What is CMMC? Good, that helps. CMMC, Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. We are looking at the new rule from the DoD that says every contractor that receives sensitive data from us needs to be compliant with this rule. The rule, and we're going to talk about this in the next slide, is final. It's effective in December, and it's going to start coming into contracts in the first quarter of 2025. What does the rule say? In general, if you're handling CUI or FCI, CUI is controlled unclassified information, FCI, federal contract information, you're handling data that's sensitive enough to the federal government and to the DoD specifically that there are restrictions. You've got to protect that data. We know this because we've had some bad experiences. We've had our F-22 plans, our F-35 plans. These are our fighter jets, end up almost entirely perfectly recreated by the Chinese. They're sitting in Chinese tarmacs because they could hack into our systems. And when the DoD went back to the Boeings and the Lockheeds and said, how did this happen? They don't know. So we have a problem. Our data leaks, our taxpayer dollars that are funding all of this research and development is essentially stolen. And that's just 2 examples of many, many thousands of examples where our critical data has not only impacted our budget, but has impacted, these people now know the weaknesses, if there are some, in our warcraft. They have data on our military. So CUI and FCI, even as simple as a federal contract, who is supplying information to the federal government, who's supplying lunch to the troops, that's critical information. And by the way, that's the way we caught a Mexican drug lord, is literally by following the taco truck. So our enemies are doing the same thing. If they know where the taco truck is delivering to a troop or our servicemen, that is sensitive enough information that we could risk lives. So federal contract information, controlled unclassified information, absolutely critical, must be protected. And the DoD finally said, Plan A, which was everybody confirm for us, sign off that you're doing it. Plan A didn't work. So Plan B is the CMMC program, which is we're going to come in and confirm that you're doing this. We're going to send third-party assessors. And that's what all of us are either educated, if not, we have our certified assessor certifications. So what does the rule say about external service providers? External service providers are almost a necessity for anybody doing business these days, especially if you're not a large company. You're going to hire outside people to help you. This could be an MSP, this could be accountants, MSSP. The rule says external service providers, if they're performing some function that's covered by the 110 controls that are part of CMMC, they're going to be subject to the assessment as well, whatever function they're providing. So what that means is anything that they're doing needs to be very well detailed. We need it in the documents. That is exactly why we're talking about that today. The documents have to illustrate exactly what that service provider is doing, how they're protecting the data. If they are only providing a security function, that is still something that is critical. How are they doing that? So ESPs don't, it's not required that they go get certified, but many of them are, and here's why. They're either going to be subject to every single assessment that every one of their clients goes through that's working for the DoD, or they're going to have to get certified themselves. In most cases, it probably makes sense if you have more than one or two clients, an external service provider probably should go get certified, because that's evidence to the DoD that yes, we are protecting data just like our client is. And you need to be certified at the same level as your client. So if there are 3 levels in the CMMC program. If you're at level 1, you're only handling FCI. Well, your external service provider needs to have level 1 self-attestations or certification. Level 2 is the third-party certification. And that's when an assessor team will come in and you're handling CUI at that point. You will need to get certified as an ESP at a level 2, and contractors. You need to make sure your ESPs either are very familiar with CMMC or they are certified. So this is a big part of the rule. Anything else, John, Daniel, you want to contribute on this?
I think you've got it well covered.
CSPs are a subset of ESPs. So all the same rules still apply, but a CSP is a cloud service provider that provides a service, and we'll look at the definition in a few slides, a service that is ubiquitous. Think Microsoft 365, think AWS. These are services that you can sign up for, and the federal government has said this is what we call a cloud service. And if you're using a cloud service provider in the CMMC space, they must be FedRAMP, moderate, or equivalent. So there's a process for them to get certified to provide their services to the federal government. They call that FedRAMP, and the process is tedious. It's often way above $100,000. It's not for everybody. So you will need to look at, who am I using for my cloud service provider, and have they already gone down that process? If they're not FedRAMP authorized, this is what the rule says, they can get an equivalency, which is not easy either. It's actually more difficult because it is 100% perfect score. But if they are FedRAMP authorized or equivalent, you can use a cloud service provider. If they're not, they're very clear, you cannot. That's part of the rule, and that falls under actually DFARS 7012. Here's what's interesting about that. The DoD has had somewhat of a difficult time defining what's FedRAMP equivalent. So when they first said FedRAMP equivalent, and this appeared in the DFARS 7012 clause, a lot of people made assumptions of what equivalent was, and the DoD clarified in a memo that came out in January of this year. Here's what equivalent means, and it's a perfect score under the FedRAMP moderate standards. That caused everybody to say, are you serious? We didn't expect that. That was a surprise. And how can we possibly get there? That's very difficult. So I know of one company that has done that since. There may be a few out there, but it is not an easy lift or an easy test to meet. So the DoD, and the guy who specifically wrote the memo is the Chief Information Officer at the DoD. His name is David McCune. He has somewhat talked about walking this back as recently, and I had the opportunity to be in a seminar with him just 2 weeks ago, as recently as that seminar. And I asked him, what are you going to do with FedRAMP? He indicated that they may take away the equivalency. So this is also something that I think all of you should be prepared for. And he actually, I think, used more certain terms than may. He even talked about how they would likely walk away the equivalency. They would revise DFARS 7012. If they do that and they only stay with FedRAMP authorized, that is also impactful to everybody here, everybody who's a contractor. You cannot use equivalent cloud service providers. You have to use those that have only been FedRAMP authorized. So stay tuned for that. One of the kind of exciting things about CMMC, but also challenging, is we're at the inception, we're at the very beginning stages, and things are changing. So these are, even this rule, this was a proposed rule as of December 26th last year. We all thought we had a pretty good idea of what the rule was going to look like. There were a few surprises, including both the ESPs and the CSPs. They changed a little bit in the final rule, actually changed a significant amount. But in one way, it's because they were listening to us, and several of us provided comments during the rulemaking process. And the DoD has to take every single comment and respond to them. And they did. And in some cases, they changed what the rule was in response to the comments. So this is still changing. The rule is final, but there are some things that still may change, including they've already indicated they want to change DFARS 7012. So stay tuned. Make sure you're working with people who are plugged in and watching this. It's almost a weekly basis that something new happens or there's some new interpretation. So this is not something that you can just read the news on occasion and stay abreast of it. You really need to align with people who are in this space, including all the panelists here. Another big change of the new rule is assessors and assessments are going to get a little more expensive because the rule said we now want 3 assessors on every assessment. Prior rule said 2. I think it makes for a better assessment. All of us in the ecosystem have learned that really the most educated people are the ones who are the assessors and lead assessors. So if you have 2 of them that can be on a same team and then a third one that's back home, so 2 of them go on site and a third one does kind of a quality review, I think you get the best work product. Even among us, we have differing opinions of how to read things, how to understand what controls are looking for. So having 2 to 3 experts that are the highest trained people that the DoD has on a team, I think makes for a better team. But that also means it's going to be a little more expensive. You've got a third person that is at the high end of the scale that you're going to have to pay for. So assessments can easily start between 35 and 40 and go up from there. And that's just the reality of where we are with third-party assessments. And I know some of them have gone over 100,000. That sounds like a big pill to swallow for a lot of contractors, but here's what the DoD has also said. just put it in your costs. We know it's going to be more expensive. We know it's going to cost more for that widget or that screw that you're making for the F-16, but we want our data secure. That's what's more important. So you build it into your costs, and we'll talk about some options on how you can basically budget this. There are lots of ways to get out there and say, I know what this is going to cost me. I know how I can put this into my quotes, and that's what the DoD is expecting. They just want it done. And again, plan A was, hey guys, you all need to do this. So when the DoD first said we've got a problem and we need to patch the leak, they started asking everybody to self-attest that, yes, we're doing all this. So the other argument the DoD makes is, you're talking about how expensive this is, but you told us you already did this. So come on, it shouldn't be as expensive as you claim it is, because allegedly, according to all these self-attestations, you've been doing it. So the DoD is at a point now where they are just, nope, go get it done. We know it's going to cost money. You can get it out of the back end. Contractors, there are some things that are different. And again, OSAs and OSCs somewhat seem interchangeable, but OSA is a little bit broader. OSA is anybody that is in the ecosystem, even the people who are self-attesting. So back to level 1, everybody has to self-attest that I'm handling FCI in the way that is prescribed by the level 1 controls, and there's 17 controls. All they come from something that's been around for a long time. It's called the FAR clause. All of these controls apply to anybody handling FCI, and OSAs include that entire group. OSCs, now you're talking about organizations seeking certification. A level 1 is not a certification because you self-attested. So a certification applies to the levels 2 and 3, and we didn't discuss this before, but level 3 is actually an assessment that's done by the DoD itself. They have a branch called DIBCAC that comes in and does level 3 assessments. Level 2 is all of us in the assessor pool, and it's a pretty small number. One of the things that contractors need to understand is this program is, it's pretty hard for the people to get trained up, and we don't have that many assessors. Many of the people that we've talked to are booked for all of 2025 already. And that means if you guys want to get assessed, you need to start on this process. Typical time for assessment, for preparation for an assessment, and this is across the DIB, the Defense Industrial Base, the polls say it's 9 to 12 months. So if you think, hey, I might have a contract coming up in a year that I need to get ready for, 9 to 12 months is the average right now. See where you are right now, and if you haven't already started on that process, you should ASAP. But second, we've got a backlog already, and the rule just hit a week ago. So this means people are trying to scale up. We're trying to get more assessors. I'm training probably 12 or so a month, and there are other trainers out there, but we are going to see a huge bottleneck. That's probably the biggest bottleneck, is the number of people that are able to do the assessments. So all of you out there that are thinking, hey, I'm just going to be able to call and get in next week and get my assessment done, I think it's going to be very difficult. There may be a few out there that are just coming out and able to do this, but it's really a tight workforce right now. Anybody else want to add to this?
I
Let's
will
talk-
add to that.
Perfect.
As far as assessors, just so everybody on this call understands, the rule tightened up the restrictions on who can actually be an assessor compared to what the Cyber AB had originally. So there may be a reduction in the near future of current assessors in the pool to meet the new DoD final rule requirements. So if you know somebody or somebody on your staff is a CCA, that is something to keep in mind right now. This will come up later in our discussions, because we highly recommend having somebody who is trained up and understands how to run an assessment internally.
There's some great questions, and thank you, Daniel. I'm glad you brought that up. That is critical, and that also means that even some of the people who are assessors right now aren't going to be able to be lead assessors. That pool just got even smaller. So
Yeah.
there has
And
to.
Brandon Smith just asked in chat, what are the new assessor requirements? You need to have 1 year of assessment experience just for CCA. You have to have certificates under some DoD employment requirements. And if you want to be lead CCA, you have to have 5 years of leadership experience in leading assessment teams, along with some additional training certificate requirements. So it really tightens up the market availability, especially for those of us who are more entrepreneurial minded and we don't go out and have employment histories that require certificates.
And then, let's see, Denitra, great question. I just want to bring this to everybody's attention. This rule is currently being piloted by the DoD, but that's another question I had for David McCune. And we've heard the rumors, actually, we've seen the evidence already, that this is going to go to many other federal agencies. So if you are a government contractor in general, stay tuned. You're probably going to need to go down this path. The DoD said it's critical for national security. We're going to implement this first, but other agencies are taking note, and most of the agencies have some kind of CUI that they handle. So if you have CUI, that's what needs to be protected the most. So this isn't top secret information. It's controlled unclassified information, but it is still critical information. It's, for example, how you build a warplane. Those technical drawings or those specs, that needs to be protected. And that certainly goes beyond the DoD. There's a really interesting history to CUI. The reason we're here is in part because of 9/11. Before 9/11, all the agencies had their own words for sensitive information, their own terminology, and they each had their own rules for when they could share it. We learned post 9/11, looking back, what did we do wrong here? How could we have done a better job? One of the biggest issues was agencies are not sharing this confidential information, this important, critical information to the national security, but they just weren't talking to each other because they had their own rules. During the Obama administration, Obama said, we're going to call all this sensitive information the same thing. It's called controlled unclassified information. The term CUI was born. All the agencies, you're going to have to classify this stuff and share it in a way that's uniform. So we're going to give you this term. We're going to put NARA in charge of this, and NARA controls, and the DoD has a list of it too. Here's what all the CUI categories are. Here's when you mark it and when you don't. And everybody in the CMMC ecosystem has to go through training on what CUI is, what to identify, how to identify it. But then post-Obama administration, everybody plays with the same rules, which allows for better sharing, better access to the sensitive information, and hopefully something like 9/11 would never happen to us again as a result. So that's what got us here. That also means all federal agencies have the same rule already in place with CUI. So could they roll out the exact same requirements under CMMC? It's pretty easy to do that. So we expect that. We have already seen DOE starting to do that. And I would say anybody who's in this federal government business, supplying goods or services to the federal government, this is your time to start to get ready for this.
And then
Chris, Daniel commented on part of this, but I had a question that I think is probably worth bringing up, and that's about the financial implications of this, the costs of getting through the gap assessment and through the final assessment. And, is it going to be offset by the DoD? And, they've said generally that they certainly expect this to make the cost of their purchasing, higher because of the requirements. There really hasn't been any logistics on how what it looks like though. And I know that's frustrating. Especially as it gets down into the supply chain. It might be easy enough for the prime to jump their prices up, but then how does that flow down in a logical manner? Yeah, it's frustrating. We feel your pain. It's like we're a candidate to become a third-party assessment organization, and we have to go through the same assessment that you guys will need to go through. Yeah, so it's that's a frustration, but it is what it is, and so it's going to have to rise to the occasion.
And this is a good time to point out that the DoD has created what's called Project Spectrum, and the APEX accelerators all talk about it. And of course, APEX accelerators are a great resource as well, if not the best resource for contractors that's out there. But this Project Spectrum exists. The DoD has a lot of resources there that you can use to learn about CMMC. They used to, but they took away their self-assessment tool. But get plugged in there, see what services they can offer. However, our experience is you're gonna really need to align with a third-party group of professionals. I just think that's the best way, and ideally people that are trained at CCP and CCA level. So certified CMMC professional and certified CMMC assessor.
And something else that came up in the question I responded to was customer removing CUI markings so that the pricing would go down. Can we just talk for a minute on why that is a bad idea?
Yeah, go ahead. Start that.
So there's this little thing called the False Claims Act, which allows any whistleblower inside an organization to tell the government, hey, we received this information that was originally marked CUI, for example, or we have CUI and we're not following our 7012 requirements that we attest that we are following. And the DOJ can come in and say, hey, we're going to investigate you and potentially charge you under the False Claims Act. And you will have to provide evidence that you were actually doing what you're saying you're doing. And if you're not, you can be charged up to 3 times the value of the contract. The whistleblower can make a monetary windfall from this. And if you want to jump to the page, it's also preponderance of the evidence, not a simple, reasonable beyond all doubts, but just we're fairly certain you were lying. So it's much easier to get that. And in fact, there is very recent news involving a university and a whistleblower that got paid off. So anyone who is currently dealing with this might want to talk to your customer, unless they're the DoD themselves and they mismarked a print CUI, which does happen all the time. I agree with the comments. Plenty of contracting officers still don't understand what CUI is, and MIL standards are a great example. MIL standard print is not CUI, it's publicly available information, but this also gives you a great time to open up a conversation and go, hey, it's my understanding what you just provided me is not CUI. Could we go through this together and have that as a learning example, which could make you have a better relationship with this contracting officer that tells them that you know what you're talking about, and maybe that helps you with further bids down the line? Maybe. But yeah, I just wanted to bring that up because it's a great way to have some people either, at bare minimum have to pay out a large check, or, maybe end up in prison.
Let's definitely talk about this for a number of reasons. I'm glad it came up. The False Claims Act is getting so common right now that the DoD has record-breaking penalties that have been associated with it. 2022, $2.2 billion in penalties alone. And that's not even speaking to, wait, I could go to jail as well. So the DoD has has in many, many cases just referred these people, and this is from going in to a OSC and saying, hey guys, are you really doing what you said you're doing? And they refer it over to DOJ if they're not. It's that simple. If you are self-attesting, and this is everybody in this ecosystem, even the guys that are just supplying toilet paper because you have FCI, if you're self-attesting, the penalties are incredible if you lie. And that also applies to not marking CUI when it's supposed to be marked. It's all of the above. The DOD is done with, and they went down this path. Like I said, that was plan A, and they're done with that. They're not going to put up with anybody who says, oh yeah, we're doing that, wink, wink. So $4 million for Verizon just saying, hey, we got security standards when they're not there. That simple statement saying, yeah, we're playing by the rules is not going to fly. Like Daniel said, up to 3 times the amount of whatever the government was defrauded. So they go after this aggressively. And I can't say how crazy it is that this is a preponderance of the evidence, that you can defend yourself from a traffic ticket easier than you can defend yourself from a False Claims Act, because a traffic ticket at least requires beyond reasonable doubt. And again, speaking to the whistleblowers, this is imperative that you have a culture in your companies where you're listening to people. And that's what the DOD is also saying. If you've got somebody who comes to the DOD, here's what's interesting. They can actually sue, the whistleblowers sue the company on behalf of the DOD. The DOD doesn't even have to be notified first. And the lawyers are all over this, as you can imagine. This is called a qui tam suit. So the lawyers are waiting, and they have whistleblower specific lawyers. They're just waiting for somebody who says, hey, I don't think, like Penn State, that was a qui tam suit. I don't think Penn State is protecting this data like you think they are. The lawsuit gets initiated overnight. The federal government doesn't even need to find out until the lawsuit has started. And then they decide, do I want to hop in? Or maybe I'll wait for 6 months and see how it plays out. So this is big money. This is a big problem. And the stakes are high now that they're requiring self-attestations from everybody. Perfect kind of rabbit hole there. I also wanted to mention one more thing on this slide. A new thing for contractors in this new rule a week ago is you got to keep all of your evidence for 6 years. Never had that before. Reason is the DoD wants you to be able to prove, again, this is related to false claims, prove that this is the evidence I had. If for some reason there's a contest 6 years down the road that, oh no, you said you were doing that, but you weren't really, guess what? The assessors don't have that evidence. We don't keep that because that is considered proprietary to the company and sensitive information. So it's on you, contractors. You've got to have a great way of keeping evidence. And Ozzy, I want you to weigh in here because Ozzy comes to our panel with a wealth of experience with evidence and tracking that. And if you can speak to why this is so imperative and why they need to use a really organized system, which he created after consulting with the DoD for years on CMMC itself. Ozzy saw an opportunity to create a system that tracks all that. So if you can speak to that issue.
Yeah, absolutely. So normally what we tell folks is to invest in a solution to manage the entire security program in your organization. So typically that's a GRC product that falls into that category, which is governance, risk management, and compliance. And there's a lot of SaaS GRC products out there. What you want to focus on is which ones are going to minimize the pain in preparing and managing and maintaining compliance. And on the evidence side, one thing that we commonly found is whenever we were involved in a joint surveillance voluntary assessment in the past for CMMC with an OSA, oftentimes we'll find out that they have prepared evidence from a prior internal assessment they did maybe a year prior to their actual formal assessment with C3PAOs and DIVCAC assessors. And At that time, they have to go back and quickly, scramble and figure out how to update all of their artifacts. And that ends up being very, very time consuming. If we look at how many objectives you have to respond to, there's 320 in CMMC level 2. And so that's potentially 320 points of evidence. But I always tell folks, this is a many-to-many relationship. So you may end up with, let's say, 5 different distinct evidence points that are associated to a single objective. So you say 5 times 320, you can see that it gets out of hand very, very, very quickly. So usually I'll tell folks, create a system or a process. And if you can use a tool, use a tool. If not, your system and process should focus on how are you going to manage and maintain this evidence to be revisited often as it relates to like maintaining changes. So one thing that I always tell folks is, especially if you have a procedure process to support policy requirements, that could be essentially like once a week, you're reviewing user accounts and their permissions in your environment, right? That could be once a month, you're doing vulnerability scans. If you can create an auditable paper trail through a system or a process, then you can easily demonstrate at any given time, and especially around the context of false claims, that you are doing what is minimally required. And there's a legal term for it. They call it due care, due diligence. So your defense in the event of false claim or a negligence claim, you'll be able to say, I believe I've done my due care, due diligence and maintained the minimum requirements and have consistently maintained that. And I can show you an auditable paper trail of why that is. And I think that's also why the 6-year retention of artifacts came about, because of these False Claims Act, because then it's less of a he said, she said situation, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Ozzy, to your point of the 6 years, OSAs are expected to do the same hashing requirement as we do during a certification assessment. So it's not such a thing like many business owners, especially small business owners, where they are like, oh, I'll just backfill that information in a later date, put a different date on it, and be good. No, that won't work.
Yep, makes sense. Absolutely.
Let's talk about hashing real quick. That's a new term for a lot of people, I suspect. Hashing is a way of completely putting a bunch of random characters on a page that represent what the page used to look like, but you can't discern what it was. So you can't undo it. Let's say it's the most confidential, it's top secret information. If you hash it, you can't say, oh, I know exactly what it says. There's no way to undo that. But it also proves what you looked at, because if you change a period or one letter on that page, it will be a totally different hash. That's what we use for evidence. So when we finish up an assessment, the OSA or the OSC has to hash everything for us, and then we hash all the hashes of all the documents into one big hash. That proves that this is what we saw at the assessment, and we don't walk out with any of the sensitive information. It all stays with the OSC. But if they change anything, if for some reason there's a fight over this and it escalates, this is our proof of what we saw, and they would have to demonstrate that, oh no, this is what they looked at, and it has to match up with the hash. If it doesn't match, they're going to have a hard time proving, oh no, this is what they looked at. So that's how we take away the quote evidence, but it's not taking any sensitive information from the OSC. That is a sensitive topic for most OSCs, because they know what they're dealing with is not only proprietary, sometimes it's a market advantage. They don't want that going out the door, rightly so. So it doesn't go out the door. That's what the assessment involves. One important aspect of these is the sensitive information itself. Contractors, they don't even want to share it with other subs. So this is why when we come in, we are there as a guest. We are only there on a limited basis, and by agreement, we're not going to walk out with anything else. So everybody understands the sensitivity of this situation. I'll also say there are 3 forms of evidence that assessors are looking for every single objective. We're looking for at least 2 of the 3, and we're looking for the best 2 that we can find of the 3. And it's not always going to be the same, but we are looking for what is the actual document, or we're going to look for some kind of documented evidence that could be, is it a policy? Is it something that we can get a list printed out? Is it some kind of a data dump? Maybe it is a log. So some kind of a documented evidence, we call that examining. So that's one way that we look for evidence that this contractor is compliant. The second way is we interview. Just like it says, we're going to go in and talk to the people who are actually doing this. I don't want to talk to the CEO if the CEO is not the one who's implementing. We want to talk to the guy who's actually setting up the security controls in the way they're supposed to be set up. Okay, how do you do this? How do you make that happen? If there's a physical security to the building, who's in charge of that? Who makes sure that there's escorted guests? I want to talk to the guy that's in charge of that part of the process, because guests have to be escorted under CMMC. So that's the second form of evidence. And the third form then is testing. And this applies to some of the controls, not all, but we actually go in and say, your policy says this. Maybe it's 3 times that somebody enters the wrong password and it locks them out. Let's make sure that happens. And that would be a perfect example of a test that I'd rather see than just trust a policy as evidence. I want to actually go in and confirm this is the way it's properly configured. And guess what? All that evidence that we just talked about, you need to track it. It needs to be screenshots and put in some kind of a tracking system, and a spreadsheet just isn't going to cut it. So this is where an IntelliGRC product, where you can say, yep, we did that, here's evidence of that, that's going to help you tremendously.
And Chris, if I may add,
Please.
just on the hashing aspect. So one thing I wanted to clarify for some of the audience who aren't familiar with the term, in the information security world, there is a methodology concept called the CIA triad. This is how you determine risks and baseline control requirements. And CIA stands for confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So the hashing requirement that came in for CMMC is in the focused context of integrity. And I say that because when they say, hey, if you're providing for a formal assessment, a file as evidence, that file, you should also be able to produce a hash value. And so there's several tools out there. Again, most GRC tools are starting to do this. We do this ourselves, where we'll generate a hash, and it's a certain set of characters and digits. And the whole point of it is that hash is correlated to a point in time, right? So it's kind of like revision history of documentation. It's a point in time. And the idea behind it is if you have a hash that you could show has changed, that means any data in that file has changed, then that gives the assessor the understanding that, okay, this is a piece of artifact that has changed over time from maybe the first time that they looked at it. And so that's kind of the purpose behind hashing. And then on the evidence, just going back to like the complexity of managing and maintaining evidence. One thing that always I notice as a pain point is also oftentimes you'll see, and I'm not sure if every C3PAO is doing this going forward, but in the DIBCAC assessments, they had provided a prescriptive outline of how they wanted those artifacts submitted, right? So that was a folder structure and a file naming convention. And so they wanted you to rename files with the practice ID and the objective letters that it supported. So I remember in our first joint surveillance, we spent 80 hours just renaming a bunch of files and moving them into different folders. And then at that point, that's when we decided in our product to build a feature to do that. So there is that aspect of just having somebody maintaining artifacts and evidence. And then in my experience from joint surveillance assessments that I've been a part of, I always tell folks, because they'll tell me how much evidence is enough evidence. And so I'll tell folks that my suggestion is if you have the ability for each objective, even if DIBCAC or the C3PO says, I'm going to do a demonstration of this, like in that use case where Chris was describing testing a control, such as trying 3 bad passwords on a system and seeing if it potentially locks you out. I always tell folks, like, even if it's a demonstration, still prepare a screenshot of that setting and a screenshot of maybe the results. Go log into your computer and put 3 bad passwords, show that it gives you the message that your account is locked out, take a picture of that and include that as well. And I always tell folks that on the demonstration side, I always suggest folks for each objective to describe a simple bulleted list of essentially rehearsing what it is you're going to demonstrate. So maybe you have somebody in IT in your company and you're saying, this engineer is going to log into this system, pull up this setting and just stop, right? That does a couple things, this approach. This approach, in my experience, it essentially gets your team to make sure they don't do too much talking or overshow too much, only show what's minimally necessary, essentially control the narrative with the assessor and be confident. The second aspect is if your assessor asks for that evidence package at least a week in advance, they're going to likely skim through it. And if they already saw that screenshot of that setting, the 3 bad passwords locked the account, but they also saw the screenshot of the screen when an account is locked, they're going to anticipate that in the demonstration. So now you've psychologically prepared them for a situation that even if you did make a mistake when you did the demo and accidentally showed too much, their mind is already tied to what they previously saw because now it's jogging their memory. So again, you can control the narrative with your assessor to make sure that you have a higher probability of success. And that's what I always tell folks to do.
And I want to talk about this. This is such an important point. What are we doing with this evidence when the assessment has to happen and I independently verify during the assessment? Why do I need all this evidence in some kind of a system like Ozzy's where it shows what was happening 6 months ago or 3 months ago? Here's why. For the exact reason Ozzy said, you deliver this packet when you first retain a C3PAO, that's a certified third-party assessment organization. You deliver a packet to them, which says, here are all the ways that we believe we're compliant. Here's all our documentation, et cetera. Here's our SSP, which we'll go into detail today. That is a piece of, that's the first introduction I have to that company. I'm going to look at the SSP, probably the very first document I see, and then I'm going to start looking at the documents you provided in this packet. And the goal is the assessor is shaking his head, yes. Yep, looks, oh, this is looking good. When you put evidence in there, this is how we're doing it. This is the detailed way we're doing it. You get the assessment team saying, oh, this is going to be smooth. And by the way, there are 4 phases to an assessment that are built out in what we call the assessment process, CMMC assessment process, the CAP. The first phase, we can just do an exit if we think the client is not ready. That is part of the first phase that hey, they've just given us enough information for us to understand they're not ready for an assessment. We're not going to waste our time and resources to go down there and charge them for this because they're just not going to pass. So all of this that Ozzy's talking about, all the stuff that you have to track, that not only sets you up for success, but also gets you past phase 1. Because if we don't see some of that evidence right away, even though I can't trust a screenshot, somebody could have manipulated that, at least I'm shaking my head, okay, good. Now I have to go in as an assessor. It's my job to confirm that screenshot is accurate, that this is how they do it, because we aren't allowed to trust screenshots. But you guys have established a relationship with us as an assessment team that, oh, good, this is exactly how they configured it, and that's a good thing. And many of these controls aren't implemented in only one way. It could be, you can satisfy CMMC in 1,000 different ways. So it may be that your company says, no, we don't do it the same way everybody else did. This is our way of doing it. And that could still be compliant. But this helps us understand how your company does business and how you've been compliant, hopefully, for months and months. And this isn't just what we don't want to see is, hey, we just set this up last week and now we're trying to go through an assessment. We want a maturity for the company. It's cybersecurity maturity model. So we want to see that for months, if not years, this is what people have been doing, and it's the mindset of the company to be secure. Yeah, Anthony's another trained assessor in our group here. OSC assessment teams should expect to produce and have a need to hash upwards of 300 to 600 actual physical files for a period of 6 years. Yeah, that's a good estimate. Okay. Another thing that I saw a comment about, and I want to speak to briefly, is CUI marking. We talked about it, but one of the biggest problems is people are still learning what CUI is, and that includes the federal government. Let's talk about that, and then we're going to move on to implementation. CUI is mishandled all the time, every day, even by the DoD. So here's what your job is. If you get CUI, you still are obligated to protect it. If somebody sent you CUI and they weren't supposed to, you are obligated to tell them. And that doesn't mean that you're in trouble or anything like that if you get CUI that you weren't supposed to get, but you do have, in this ecosystem, you have an obligation not only protect it, but mark it properly. And when somebody else hasn't, to advise them that, hey, this looks like it should have been marked CUI. You'll find that even the government's doing that. Just so you know, the way of doing business has been to foolishly even just blast out a mass newsletter or email with a whole bunch of recipients that should not be seeing CUI, and often it'll have CUI attached. We're getting away from that, obviously. That's not safe. Anybody could have forwarded that. Somebody could have signed up for a list and received CUI that didn't have a background check, didn't have all the requirements that CMMC requires. So we're getting away from that, but that's the reality of where we've been for years. So we've got an education ahead of us, and that includes even with the DoD.
And Chris, if you don't mind, one thing that I was going to add to the CUI marking is historically the legal advice has been that by default, marking data as CUI is the responsibility of the government and not the OSAs, unless that is written in the contract. That if that OSA is creating CUI, then you would look inside of your contract task order. You'll be able to see the specific statement. And if you're unsure, we always tell folks to ask your POC, who's your customer, right? If you're a prime, then you're talking to your contracting officer. And then every time I'm engaging in a consulting arrangement with a client, and they're saying, hey, I think I have CUI, I've seen it, I'm not sure, and I'm not sure where it is. I always tell folks, you know, if you just simply look at your contracts and then say, or even if you're a sub-tier supplier to a prime, and you see, what is it that you're producing? What is it you're selling? And it always comes down to two things. It's either products or services, right? Because those are the only two things you could sell. And so if you focus on what it is you're selling and you figure out how does that data come in and how does that go out as a deliverable, you can essentially reverse engineer that and figure out that, okay, I can just safely make that assumption that this is likely going to be CUI. So even if you don't mark it as such, why not treat it as such, right? And I always tell folks, let's worry less about what's currently happening and let's focus on the intended desired state. So when we're doing scoping conversations with customers out there, we're always telling them, let's not worry about where it currently is, right? Let's focus on where we want it to be. Like where you currently are is likely going to be that it's not being handled the way it needs to be handled. And so let's focus on designing systems and processes on how it should be handled. And then that creates the picture of this is the desired state. Now you view your gap and figure out where you currently are and how to get there. So I always tell folks, let's not get stuck in analysis paralysis, just figuring out what we currently are doing and what we currently have. Let's focus on what we should be doing and what we should be having.
Awesome. And JR brings up another good point on this in the chat, that CUI is a gray area for a lot of people. Even the federal employees find it safer to mark everything as CUI. You guys as contractors need to get trained on what it is so that you can, like Ozzy said, be able to identify internally what is it we're creating. This is the definition. It's information that the government creates or possesses, or here's the entity or a contractor creates or possesses for on behalf of the government. So if you have a government contract, it's very possible you are creating CUI for that contract. If they say, we want a widget that does X, Y, and Z, and you build that, you engineer that, you've most likely created CUI in doing that. So that's when you have to internally understand what you're dealing with, because even the federal government doesn't get it right. And their jobs, because they're writing on it many times, they worry about their jobs. They mark a whole lot of stuff as CUI. Some of them don't mark anything and others overmark. And that's just where we are right now. There needs to be more education. CUI is relatively new, but definitely not enough people understand it well enough. So this is straight out of the CFR, the definition of CUI. But you want to consult with people and take the training for anybody who's handling it so you can properly identify it in your company. I want to move into implementation. So we talked a little bit about the rule. We can return to any topics that come up, but when is this going to happen? Well, the new rule is effective 12/16 this year. So as of the 16th of December, any contractor can go out and get an assessment. And you go to Cyber AB, which is where we are all certified through, find a C3PAO, find an assessor, and the greatest thing about CMMC is you get to pick. It's not luck of the draw. You want to align with somebody who's guiding you and then who can refer you to a really good assessment team. It's critical. Everybody here, this is new for everybody. We're all learning every day, but you don't want the guy that's not paying attention, or girl. You want an assessment team that really understands, that looks at things in a way that is exactly what you're thinking is compliant, because you don't want to just roll the dice and have a very inexperienced crew. So the new rule does allow for assessments to happen as of 12/16. For those of you who are servicing the DIB, those of you who are external service providers, might be a good time to get at the front of the line, because that line is going to get extremely long, like we discussed. Now, when will we see it in contracts? That's dependent on 48 CFR. That's the procurement aspect of this whole thing. The 32 CFR, the new rule we're talking about, is the technicals. How do you do it? How do you assess people? What are the controls? That's all built into 32 CFR. But the 48 is, okay, this is how it's going to go into contracts. That is right now just finished with the comment period, just wrapped up a couple weeks ago. What the DoD has to do with that, just like any other agency, with any CFR, with any rule that they propose, they have to take all the comments, respond to every one of them, and maybe or maybe not change the rule. They did it with CFR, with 32 CFR. They did change some things. With 48 CFR, maybe they change things, maybe they don't, but we expect it to be fully effective first quarter 2025. The DoD is moving quickly on this stuff, so you can see this in contracts as soon as first quarter 2025. However, that's not your only two factors. The DoD specifically in 32 CFR said, we're going to make it a 4-year rollout. So it's going to be phased over the 4 years, and some contracts may not have it until the 4th year, but is it going to be years? We don't know. Could the procurement officer, the person who's sending this money out from the DoD, who's entering the contracts on behalf of the DoD, it's up to them. They're not being told you have to wait. They can decide which projects they want to roll this out on based on the sensitivity that they have to this data going out. So they could say, you're the first, congratulations. The other factor here is primes. The prime contractors are the ones that really get the money directly from the DoD, and many of them have hundreds, if not thousands, of subcontractors. If you go to any industry event, and I've been to several with the APEX accelerators, but also private events where the contractors, the primes, get people together, get business people and contractors underneath them to discuss CMMC. One of the very first topics on every one of these is, where are you in the CMMC process? Why? Because it's on the prime for every one of their contractors subs to be certified. If one of their subs is not certified, they can lose the contract, they can be fined, they can be subject to the False Claims Act. This is such a big deal for primes that they are driving this right now. We are getting most of our clients because their prime told them, you need to go get certified. So wait until 2026, 2027. I don't think that's wise, no matter where you are on the supply chain. Your prime will most likely be talking to you, if they haven't already, about, go get this done now, or I'm going to have to find somebody else. Which leads us to the last point. There is an opportunity here. We think this is the great shakeup that has never before happened. All of these existing relationships where the primes have been working with a subcontractor for 10 years, 20 years, and yeah, they've always done what we needed and they have the cost that we need. That can be blown away if you walk in and say, I'm certified already. What do you need me to do? Anything you want done right now that you don't have to worry that the sub is going to go get certified. We think this is, and we're telling every one of our clients, this is the time for you to go get out early and tell the world, I'm certified, because that is so valuable to the prime. It's make or break. They could lose their contract. So that's just a critical thing to be able to put on your capability statements and to be able to put in your correspondence. Hey guys, we're already certified. So for that reason alone, I think a lot of business decisions should favor go get certified as soon as you can. Let's go into a little bit more detail on the ESPs. This was previously a requirement. The rule did say, we're not going to, we listen to you. We're not going to require it of all ESPs. But here's the exact verbiage. The services provided by the ESP are in the OSA, that's you contractors, assessment scope, and shall be assessed as part of the OSA's assessment. So anything that ESP is doing, we need to have absolute transparency, know exactly what they're doing. If we're coming in on an assessment team, we're going to say, where are all the details? How do I know what they're doing? I want to see it. So it's going to have to be in the contractor's possession of all that they're doing as I'm going through the assessment, which means either the ESP is showing up there to go through it, or they provided such a detailed agreement with a shared responsibility matrix, they call it now customer responsibility matrix, that it's so clear to the assessment team, these guys are doing it. If they get certified, even better. Now I feel much more comfortable that ESP, MSP, MSSP, okay, they're doing what they need to do to protect this data. You want to chime in on that, Ozzy?
Yeah, sure. So one thing that I was going to kind of touch on to support kind of what you just stated there is CMMC is very much a data-centric framework. So obviously the data in focus is CUI. And it's important to understand the context behind it, which is the framework is developed only from a bias standpoint of the DoD's risk relative to CUI, the confidentiality of CUI. So the risk aspect of determining what's minimally required was already done by the DoD, right? And that is essentially CMMC. So if we focus on this data-centric approach of where CUI, who is touching it, we can easily determine the scope. Now, an ESP may not need to touch CUI, but the emphasis will be on logical segmentation or physical segmentation capabilities, right? Essentially, how are you making sure that this external service provider, say your IT managed service provider, is not touching that data? And a lot of these MSPs out there use remote access tools like RMM, remote management and maintenance products, so they can jump on somebody's computer to do IT support. And in that situation, as long as you can create in your agreements with that IT MSP that they're not allowed to exfiltrate it, and that they should also tell their end users that they're connecting to their computers on, that you should probably close or minimize anything that might have CUI on the screen so that I can do my part and fix whatever it is the issue is. And so those are multiple mitigating factors, right? If an MSP, however, were to give you also a shared responsibility matrix or a customer responsibility matrix and say, hey, our services we're doing for you covers this aspect, right? Which is, these are the things you don't have to worry about, bone management, because we're doing it for you, right? So you could totally say this is inherited by our process and what it is that we're selling to you. And then on the aspect of policies and procedures, maybe for physical or employees, personnel security policies, right? That's obviously going to be on the OSA side, right? And so as long as that MSP can clearly delineate what it is that they do for their customers in terms of implementing or supporting a control requirement, or what it is that they partially do on their end, or what are the things that you cannot inherit from them and is totally your responsibility as the OSA. If they can clearly articulate that, then that's a huge, huge win. And that is the type of artifact you do need to have ready with your assessors. And obviously the easiest route is also if they were to get certified through some means themselves, then that just minimizes a ton of sales barriers, right? And just makes that acquisition of that MSP services much easier. So I always tell folks, you need to clearly understand what it is that they are touching and what specifically that they've delineated in the context of CMMC requirements as what they're taking care of, what they're partially taking care of, but you have some aspects of responsibilities for, and what are the things that they absolutely don't take care of and what you're fully responsible for. Yeah.
And we have some great examples coming up in the next two slides of what you should expect from ESPs. This is not what most of them are delivering right now, but your assessment rides on it. If you miss a control because your ESP didn't fully detail what they're doing, you can fail your assessment. So this is something that is changing the business out there. And if you have an ESP who doesn't know what CMMC stands for, run away. It's time to find one that is in this ecosystem that is either very well schooled on what they have to deliver in this shared responsibility matrix, or they're certified because they've been down that path and they understand.
And
so that's, go ahead.
And Chris, I want to add to this because Robert Ellis brought up a comment in chat. Touching the data in the course of their work or feasibly having access if they're abused their access or were breached. Absolutely. If they are inside the CMMC scope, that counts. So it could be as simple as somebody who just provides door lock service. Even though they're security protection data, that's a breach of your assessment scope. So you need to be made aware, and if any data relevant needs to be passed on to the DoD, there's an entire process for notifying the DoD of breaches.
One other thing I was going to quickly mention is the external MSPs out there. If they don't have a certification themselves and can prove that, they're going to be required to provide that shared responsibility matrix. And there is a likelihood, it's not entirely depicted as a requirement, that C3PAO assessor is going to ask them to participate in the assessment. And the reasoning for that is because they are no different than an extension of your organization as an IT department, right? So either if you have an in-house IT department, they're going to participate in the assessment as well. But if you don't, that MSP is going to need to participate. And that could be very, very busy for that MSP, right? If they're sitting in every assessment for every one of their DIB customers, that could be very, very time consuming. And so I always tell folks, just make sure they're aware of the probability that they'll need to participate, right? And then just on the topic of Robert Ellis and kind of what was brought up in terms of touching the data in the course of that work, I always tell folks the strategy that we've taken with previous customers when we've gone through a joint surveillance assessment is if they're using an MSP, we also recommend, like, for example, some folks will say, well, the MSP has administrative privileges like a domain admin right. So they could, in theory, access anything and exfiltrate anything. And so I always tell folks, well, there's mitigating factors that you could put in place. Like in CMMC, you can go into your risk assessment, document that risk factor, and then say, here's my mitigating factors. Mitigating factors could be a contractual obligation with your MSP that says they're not allowed to do that and touch CUI. You can also mitigate that factor by putting in monitoring and alerting. So for example, if you have a SIM solution that does log management and alerts, you can put in a specific rule set that says, if I see anybody in this security group, or i.e. the members that are my IT MSP engineers, accessing any of these specific locations, which may be the locations that you've designated as like the primary CUI hosting areas, then trigger an alert or give me a weekly report of all their user account activities, logins, logouts, and what data they pulled and downloaded. And that way, somebody in your organization has oversight on them. And if they have that weekly report coming in, that's one mitigating factor that you can take into consideration. And we've seen some other MSPs take a very unique approach through our own consulting advice, where they are kind of like a staff augmentation firm. And that's actually how we helped certain clients prepare in the past, is we instead use their laptops, their domain accounts, their environment to do all of their work. We did not use our company's assets at all. So essentially, it's like all I'm providing them is staff aug, right? Giving them a body, and it's their endpoints and their systems, right? So everything stays in their scope to keep me out of scope. So that's another strategy you can always look into.
Yeah, and that is actually becoming more and more common. I've had the pleasure of being able to teach a bunch of MSPs in my classes, and many of them are looking at that exact solution, Ozzy, where can we come in and just use their resources, and then they don't even have to worry about all these permissions that they're giving us. And that's another way to skin this cat. The DoD has identified also, which is awesome in the new rule, that a VPN solution is not in scope. So you can actually set it up so that somebody has access to your data through a VPN, and that will not be part of your scope, which is of course, it's got to be configured correctly. But that's a wonderful thing that actually made it in writing into the rule. Virtual desktop solution, sorry. Virtual desktop, you're right, Robert, is what made it in. Okay. Final, we said this briefly, but one final critical point that changed is your tech stack doesn't have to be entirely FedRAMP authorized, only your cloud services. So previously, everybody was functioning under what the provisional rule was, or the proposed rule. We thought every service that a MSP or ESP would use had to be FedRAMP authorized, and every service that a company or a contractor used. That's not the case anymore. Only your cloud services. This is the kind of detail you need to see for any of your ESPs. So this is an example of a organization that's using both an MSSP and an MSP. Very common. Note that there are some RACI roles that are listed in here. What you're looking for is this kind of detail for every single objective that is in CMMC. And you can see here that the objectives are spelled out on the left side, and then there's a security requirement that's straight out of the CMMC assessment guide. Then here's what the MSSP does. Here's what the MSP does, and here's what the contractor themselves in the rightmost column does. That's the kind of detail that we're looking for with every external service provider you're going to have. I want to see this kind of detail. So like Ozzy said, you need somebody who's coming in that either understands all this or provided this to you, or have somebody internal who's doing this that just becomes part of your team. John put an example of Microsoft's shared responsibility matrix. Again, this is going to be shared responsibility matrix or customer responsibility matrix. The terms are kind of interchangeable, but the rule itself calls them a CRM. You can look at some of these links to get examples.
Just a real quick note on the link that you're about to open. If you open that spreadsheet, you're going to have to break the cardinal rule that your cybersecurity consultants will tell you to never do, and that's enable macros on the file. because Microsoft built them into the file and it won't work without them. Trust them though. You can trust them.
This is the infamous placemat, right? That you just linked.
Yes. This is this is the latest release, just literally last week.
Awesome. Yeah, Microsoft's done a good job of giving resources in the CMMC space. One of the other things that I heard from McCune, he was asked specifically, hey, the rumor is the DoD is going to provide their own cloud service where they can hold CUI there. And he said, no, we're not going to do that. But we are working with the major cloud service providers, whoever that might be, to have kind of a blessed scenario that the DIB can use. So even though a lot of us think, oh, GCC High that Microsoft has, that's a safe place to be. GCC High lost its FedRAMP status recently. So even that technically would not have passed an assessment. You'd have to go with the equivalency, which Microsoft has had to put out. Here's what you need to do to pass an assessment right now. But the DoD is talking about, apparently, creating for every one of the major cloud service providers, a platform that the DoD says, yes, this one is good. You can use this and be compliant. So stay tuned, that may be coming soon. Here's another shared responsibility matrix, just to give you guys another example. Again, critical for anybody you're using outside of your own organization. You need this kind of detail. This needs to be in your SSP. This needs to be attached as an exhibit to your packet that you send off to your assessor at the very beginning. And this absolutely must articulate what the OSA does need to do and doesn't need to do. There are such things as partial and full inheritance. It could be that I don't need to do anything because Microsoft already does that in GCC High. Great. We need to see that reflected in your SSP and other documentation. Or yeah, we have to go in and configure it this way, and this is how we configured it. We need to see that. Those are the kind of details that assessors are looking for. You can't just show up with an SSP that's 7 pages long. We have kind of a funny story of a client that did that. This is a client that, well, they're not a client yet, but we expect it any day. They are handling top secret materials, working with the DoD, felt very confident in their standing, and didn't need anybody to help them out on the CMMC process. And they submitted a perfect 110 SPUR score and also submitted their SSP. Well, the DoD said, yeah, we'd like to come and take a look at that. And we learned that the SSP was extremely short. We sat in on the phone call with DIBCAC and the DoD. DIBCAC said, this isn't even a SSP that's tailored to CMMC. It doesn't mention 171. That's a problem. You need a new SSP. Secondly, anybody who says they're perfect at this stage probably isn't. So we'd like to come and take a look under the hood. That's where the DoD is, and that goes back to False Claims Act. You might be in the most lucrative contract that the DoD hands out in your state. Maybe you're doing really important stuff. They're still asking, I want confirmation that our sensitive data is being handled the way that you say it is. So perfect score, you better be able to support it. If they show up and find out that you can't support that, they're going to send you over to DOJ. Have a nice conversation with them.
Hey, Chris, would now be a good time to take that 5-minute break?
I think it'd be great. Yep.
Excellent. Perfect. So we are going to take a 5-minute break for everyone to stretch their legs, use the restroom, refill your coffee. I will call everyone back together at 10:35. Thank you.